So in order to show this process from the beginning, I'm going to make a smaller version, a smaller overall square for another purpose that I'm going to use for something else, but uses the same principles, and you will learn how to do the beginning squares with it. And then we'll go back to my blanket and I'll show you how to do the bigger. So the only difference in what I'm going to do right now and what you would do for your own blanket beginning is a different count. I'm going to use a slightly different stitch count. The only difference is that I'm going to cast on 33 stitches. So as I showed in the beginning of the mitered square, I'm looping over the top. There we go. Looping over the top, then knitting one to get started. Then for the rest of these I go in the middle. Now the reason I like the cable cast on as I'm doing this is it forms, as you can see with our other stitch, it forms this neat little edge that looks kind of like the garter stitch. As I'm looking at it from the top, it just kind of looks, it just flows right into the garter stitch. So I will continue casting on until I get to 33 and I'll be back. Alright, so we've got 33 little stitches on this needle, 16 a center stitch, and then 16 more. Alright, so now we're ready to begin our first wrong side row, because our cast on is our first right side row, and we're going to knit 16. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I'm going to go ahead and, as I said before, I'm going to go ahead and knit this stitch because that's what I like to do. You can definitely purl it. So I'm turn my work over for a minute. I'm going to put my stitch marker, my locking stitch marker, around this stitch. So I've got it right around this center stitch. Then I'm going to turn my work back over. I'm going to knit that stitch and keep going. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Now, my other blanket, the one that I'm showing, has 22 on each side with a center stitch. So you can do whatever stitch count you want. They will each create different sizes of squares of the main mini square that your building block. It doesn't matter. Just depends on how big your minis are. My 22 by 22 will use 3 to 4 grams of the color. of the main color. I of course have my other gray here. Reflection. So my other gray here that I'm using as my base, and because I'm doing the stained glass, that's going to use up some of the rose. You could also do this. You could do the same technique and not do the gray and just use the colors, and you could still do all the different sizes of squares as well. So if you want to do that, just use the tutorial as your main color and forget about when I say I'm changing colors, just don't do that part. And then you could still have that and not have to worry about buying the center color or the border colors and making sure that you have all of those. All right, so we're ready to begin our first decrease row. And again, I want to try to weave my ends in as I go. So I'm going to take this, put it up over the top, and in the mitered square basic mitered square tutorial, I showed how it would be woven in, working it with the English style as well. Now this takes just a little bit of extra time than doing a row, but I think it is worth it to me because then I don't have ends left over that I'm weaving in. So I'm taking, if you can't quite see what I'm going on, I'll walk you through it. I lift up my yarn and then I'm knitting my working yarn underneath. Then I'm flopping my tail down over the top of my working yarn. Then knitting a stitch. Bringing the yarn up and knitting a stitch, flopping it back down and knitting a stitch. So I just do this until I'm, as you can see, until I'm kind of running out of yarn. And I'll usually go until my tail is really, really, really gone. All right, so now I'm one stitch before my center. So that means I should have 15 stitches on this side. Let's count just to be sure. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Let's see, let's get the light on there. 14, 15. All right, so I do have 15 stitches. So I'm going to slip these two as if to knit. And I do it both at the same time, as if I'm going to knit, do a knit two together, but I slip them onto the other needle. I knit one, then I go back in and pass those two stitches over. So I've worked my center double decrease there. Now 15 more stitches. 3, 4, okay, so that's my first right side row that has a decrease. Now I'm going to, if I just stretch this out a little bit like that, whatever little wisp of a tail has been pulled back in. And I don't need to worry about that tail any longer. Now, because I don't do that prominent center line, I do the more bumpy center line, I am just going to knit back across all of these stitches. If you wish to have the more prominent center line, then when you get to this center stitch, you will purl it. The one that's attached to this, that's this stitch right here. So when you get to this stitch, you would purl it instead of knitting it. I'm just going to go ahead and knit, and I will see you when I'm done. And then we'll talk about what's next. Okay, so I just finished knitting back across, and as you can see on this side, instead of that very straight line, I've got a purl bump right there. So that's going to give a bumpier look to my center line, which I prefer. Makes it just a little bit more subtle. And again, you can do any number of stitches you want, and it will just create a different size of square for you to work with, a different base size square. Now, I don't have any ends to weave in or anything else, so I'm just going to knit across 14 until I'm one before my center line. And I usually just kind of knit it and check. Sometimes I'll count, depends on how big it is. 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. 14, do my center decrease. Some people prefer the more pronounced center decrease with the knit on the other side instead of the purl, because it makes it just a little bit easier to see the center line. I don't have any problem just moving my stitch marker up higher so that I can see that more easily. So I finished that center double decrease. Now I'm just going to knit this 14 and then knit back across the back again. So this is my second time knitting across the front. So 1, 2, I've decreased twice. I'm going to knit back across, and then I'm done with the gray. So I've done 2 decrease rows of my gray, and I have 14. Now I started with 16 on each side of my marker, and now I have 14 on each side of my decrease. So I have knitted 3 rows, 3 times 2, so 6 rows, because I had my cast on row, my first row back, my first decrease row, my first row back, my second decrease row, and now I'm doing that row back. So I have knit 6 rows, including the cast on, just only 2 decrease rows. All right, now I'm done with the gray now, and you can see I'm starting to get that little distinctive V going on that you get when you're only doing one. All right, so now I'm going to take my scissors and snip off a little tail. I would have just broken it, but this has silk in it. So it can make it a little more painful. Now, as you can see, this center line is a little bit more hidden than this very clear center line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this down a little bit, and I'm going to move my stitch marker up so that it will be very easy to see which stitch is my center stitch. Now I can double check this because I should have 14 on each side. 2, 4, 6, 10, 12, 14. Okay, so I got that right. Now, my first color that I'm going to put in is this beautiful Sweet Georgia Cashluxe Sparkle. And this happens to be the, let's see, Smitten colorway. All right. So now we don't want any ends, so we're going to weave this end in as we get started. So I'm going to just join yarn like I join yarn. I tend to leave this one a little longer when I'm starting because I tend to pull it up shorter as I'm beginning my knitting. So I do just like that. Already it's shorter. All right. So I'll scooch my stitches up so it's a little easier. I have my first stitch, and these are both really loosey-goosey. So I want to be careful that I have a nice tail still. A decent tail. Then I want to find my gray tail and pull it around behind my work and make sure that that it's ready so I can put it over the top again of my working yarn. Now I don't want to pull too hard on my working yarn because I don't want to pull this loop out because it's just this little fragile little loop. We'll get that tied in a minute. So now that I have 2 stitches on, I can take my tail and tighten my stitches up against my needle. Now this one had just gone over the top, so now I'm going to pull it up from underneath. I'm going to pull the gray tail up from underneath, and this is now stable enough that I can just keep going again, doing my end weaving. And this might seem a little tedious to have to do while you're beginning and figuring this out. And I understand that it looks probably far easier than it feels at first. But if all you do at the very beginning until you find your rhythm is move it, then take your stitch, then move it, then take your stitch, then move it, then take your stitch, that's okay. Because basically you're just weaving this under and over your new working yarn. So now here we are, one stitch before our center stitch that's marked. So we're going to take these 2 as if to knit, just like all the others, and then over the top. And you can see, all right, Alright, so I'm going to take these 2 stitches as if I'm going to do a knit 2 together. Then I'm going to knit 1, go back through those 2 stitches and pass them over. Then I'm going to keep knitting, and I'm out of my gray over here, and you see how that's nicely woven in. Here's my, every once in a while you probably want to tug on this one so that it doesn't come back up through. Well, it's still kind of fresh. But that gray, as you can see here, is very nicely woven in. Alright, so let's finish up this row. And we should have 13 on each side. Now, for this square. All right. Now, again, I'm going to just knit back across. And you'll start to see how it's more of a subtle bump. I'll knit back across. Then I'll see you again when it's time to weave in this end here. All right, so here we are. We've got those first 2 rows over with the decrease and then back of our color. Now, I'm ready to begin this next row across that will have a decrease on the front, but I'm going to want to weave this end in. So I'm going to start by flipping it up over the top. So it's up over the top of my working yarn. It's crossed over my working yarn and I take my first stitch. Then I'm ready to just continue knitting across using that very same weaving in process that existed, that very same weaving in process that we did before. Now, here we are, right at our 1 stitch before our center double decrease. 1 stitch before our center line, which is where we do our center double decrease, which is the slip 2 stitches as if to knit, knit 1, pass those 2 stitches over. And here we have it right there in the middle. Then I finish knitting. As soon as I get to the end of this row, we'll take a look at the back and see what it looks like when we have all our ends woven in. So weaving in those ends took a little bit more time than just knitting straight across would be, but here we are. Here's how neat it is. There's our last little bit of that, and you could take a needle and weave that little bit in, or just leave it until the entire piece is finished and then see which ones are still out as it's been stretched and moved around. Could be that that works its way right back nicely in and hides itself. Or just snip it off a little bit and let it do that as well. So, we're just going to continue working back and forth, weaving in those ends. If I had wanted to, I could have kept going weaving this in, including the double decrease, and kept going. I didn't for simplicity's sake of explaining it on the tutorial, but you could have. Alright, so now we have no more ends to weave in. We're just going to keep doing our decrease and then decreases on the front side, on this side, and then knitting straight across on the back side. I will check back in with you when we're almost done. Alright, so here we are. We're almost at the end. We have 2, 4, 6, 7 stitches left. So we're just going to do these last little rows, and they start getting really fast. So with 7 stitches, I've got 2 stitches on each side, then my decrease in the middle, and then 2 more stitches. Knit across 5, because I'm just doing the knit row. Instead of if I was doing the purl, I would have knit 2, purled, and then the knit 2. If I would have wanted the more pronounced line. Okay, so only 5 more stitches left. So I take 1 stitch, decrease, then my next one, 3 more knit stitches, and 1 last double decrease. And 1 last double decrease. All right. So, although it's a little small, it'll work for the purposes it's going for, and it's the good example. The only difference if you used more stitches starting is that you would have a bigger square. So I'm going to take my locking stitch marker, put it right up here. Take my locking stitch marker, put it right up here, and trim that edge. Alright, so first square done. We are going to, next one we'll pick up, we'll either do this, so this is our bottom right hand square. We'll either do this square or we'll do this square. One or the other. See you next time. I hope you found value in this tutorial. If you have, please consider a one-time payment via PayPal or a regular subscription via Patreon. The links are down below and they are on the screen. Again, thank you for joining me. See you next time.